Yes, my name is Bench and welcome to our first tutorial on learning the basics of Photoshop. This series is designed for those who are just starting out with Photoshop to help familiarize you with the tools and windows, as well as give you a little bit of theory, but keeping it all practical to what you might like to achieve or create. So let's jump right on in and create our first Photoshop creation, creating a square image with a white border. You'll see here we've just started the software, and for us this is our view. Your view might be a little bit different, and that could just come down to which version of Photoshop you're using and whether or not you've run the software for the first time or not. But you'll see we've got a menu up the top, we've got a properties window underneath that, we've got our toolbox or toolbar with all these different tools that we can use on the left hand side, and we've got all these different panels and windows and clicky things on the right hand side. And it all surrounds this central work area. Now this is called our workspace, and for me, I've loaded up the Essentials workspace. So up the top right, we can load different configurations of workspaces. We can even define our own, but for now we'll be using the Essentials. Feel free to change yours to Essentials, so we're working all in the same workspace. If you can't see the top right, you can always go to the menu bar and select Window, and then Workspace from there, and select Essentials from there. So let's go ahead and create our first Photoshop document. We'll go to the menu bar and go to File and then New, and it comes up with this dialog box. Now you'll see here we've got a bunch of different options that we can choose. The first one that's highlighted is called Name, and this just lets us name our new Photoshop document. So we'll call it New Photoshop Document. And then underneath that you see we've got a bunch of presets that we can load. So it either has a default one or it has all these other ones. Now it might be categorized for you in the version that I'm using, I can see that. It might be slightly different for you, but essentially there's different versions or different presets for documents based on whether or not you're doing something for print or something a bit more appropriate for web. And it has all these different settings. And you can even define your own as well as you get more familiar with the program. But for now, we'll jump to default Photoshop size and then show you a couple of the settings that we'll be changing to set up our first Photoshop document. So you see here we have width and height, and if for me it says centimeters, it might say inches for you. Now, we're pretty familiar with this. It's something that we use in the real world with regards to length and measuring stuff. But for doing stuff in web or digital work, we want to select pixels. Now pixels isn't referring to that Adam Sandler film, it's referring to these little tiny little squares. So I've zoomed in and hopefully you can see them. You can see my little hand icon there is made up of all these tiny little squares that are next to each other, and these are called pixels. Now this video, believe it or not, is 1920 pixels wide and 1080 pixels high. Now 1080 might be a number that you're slightly more familiar with. If you've been watching a lot of YouTube videos, you'll know that you can change the quality from 480 to 720 or even 1080, and that just refers to how many pixels high that video is. So obviously more pixels equals more quality, but for us we're going to be creating a square image, so let's go for 1080 pixels wide, 1080 pixels high. Now resolution, you might be looking at this going, what is this number? If we change it to pixels per inch, and make sure it's on 72, and then we'll cover exactly what this number refers to in a future video. Again, we'll go to color mode, and you can see mine says RGB. Make sure yours is selected to RGB as well. It refers to the way that your document will be saving the color. Again, this is something we'll go into in a future video, along with what this 8-bit means as well. Background content, again, we'll be covering that in a future video, but for now we'll select white, and this whole advanced tab we don't need to worry about. So we'll hit OK, and you can see our first document has been created. Now this is the view that I have. If we drag our little tab up the top, you might find that your document looks a little bit more like this. Either way will work fine, but for most people when they first start up Photoshop, it'll be looking like this. So you can see this white area is our square, and you can see it has its own work area around it. Now, one of the key things for Photoshop is that Photoshop works in layers. So if we go over to the right, you'll be able to see we have our layers panel there, and you can see it has this one highlighted called background. And that's the background layer that we selected. We chose white, and now it is white. It gives us a little thumbnail of what is on that layer, and it gives us an eye, which we can't click because everything's locked, and In fact, we don't have any other layers. So you always have to be viewing one layer, and you always have to have one layer in your document. So let's create another layer. In this case, we're going to be importing or opening the image that we'll be using. I could go to File and then hit Open and grab my photo from there, or I can even just grab my File Explorer and drag my image in. So you can see here I've got my image selected, and if I drag it in, you'll see it loads after a little while and it appears like so. So if we go over to the right, you can see our photo's been loaded in as another layer. But you can see I can't really click anything, and that's because when we first import something in this method, it is actually asking us to basically place this image. And you'll hear the word place when working with Adobe software in a couple of different other programs if you're exploring some of the other programs in the Adobe suite. Place basically means that you're importing something and defining it as you initially put it in your document. So for us, we have these little square and X, and you'll see it kind of has this thing selected. You can see we have these little squares in the corner, and my icon, well, my cursor keeps doing all these changes as I surround that little cursor, and that just refers to all the different ways I can transform this image as I place it. So you can see if I grab like this top one, I can stretch it or I can squish it. If I let go, then I've done that. So if I hit Control Z or Command Z on the Mac, I believe it is, then we can change that. Again, if I drag the corner pin, you can see I'm squishing it and stretching it. Basically, this is what we call scaling. Again, I'll let go and hit Control Z. If I have my clicking around in the middle, you can see I can move it around. And if I go out further, you can see there my cursor goes into a little rotate icon. And that means I can rotate this as I place it. Now, if I don't like that, I can hit Control Z. Now, there's a couple of things for when we're placing or transforming different items or layers here in Photoshop. And these are what happens when I hold like Control, hold Shift, or hold Alt. If I hold Shift and click and scale, you can see it actually keeps it all in proportion. So Shift is handy in keeping things aligned or in proportion, all kinds of things. So whenever we're scaling something and we want to keep it all in proportion, we'll hold Shift. If we hold Shift and move it, you can see it kind of snaps to just moving along one angle. Again, I can do the same thing when I move up and down. You can see it snapping around a little bit, and that's just aligning it to different things in the document that we can't see. Now, again, if I hold Shift and I spin it, it's going to snap to different degrees that you might use. And you can see next to your cursor, it says 15, 30, 45, basically referring to different 15-degree increments. So that's handy in just getting some basis for that movement. So that's what Shift does when we're transforming things. If I hold Alt and move my scale my image, you can see it kind of all does it around the central area. And that's really useful, especially when scaling stuff, you want to keep it around the central area. Or when you're working with things like circles or whatever. If you click Alt and don't scale, you can see now we're dragging around this little target thing. This is called the anchor point. This is around what every other transform happens. So if you see, I drag it up to the top and then try to rotate around it. Now it's rotating around that anchor point. Now to get that back, I can also click on the anchor point without holding Alt and drag it back into the middle of the X, and you'll see it snaps back in there. And then that is where it will live. Now, if I hold Control, this will let me actually modify these actual corner points. And this lets me sort of skew or distort my image. So you can see I'm distorting it like so by dragging that one corner point around. And that's useful for, say, if I was placing this on, say, an iPad image or an iPhone image, but we don't want to do that now. What we want to do is we want to scale this into our actual square image, but we want to scale it from the center point so that we know where we're placing it. So we'll hold Alt and Shift, and we'll scale it up just so it fits that point. Now, when you're transforming or placing, you'll see up the top, you get these two options. One is this cancel transform, and the other is commit transform. So the cancel little symbol or the tick. And that basically is like, if you're happy with how that transform has gone, you can click the tick and it will save that. So at this point, we're working with this image, but we haven't actually placed it. We haven't actually said, this is what I want to change about these pixels that make up this image. I'm just sort of playing around with how I want it to look. And I can cancel out of this and change it back to whatever it is. If I hit cancel now, I'd actually close the whole image and it would lose the layer because I haven't actually initially placed it in. Or if I hit the tick, like we'll do now, you'll see we've placed it now. We have our new layer and it is placed. Now let's have a look at some of the other tools that we have at our disposal. At the moment we have the move tool. So if we go over to the toolbar, you can see we have move tool selected. Move tool will be your default. That's what we go back to when we're not using one of the other tools. And the move tool is good because similar to when we transformed and move stuff around, we can do the same with our layer. So we can see here we can click down on this layer and drag it around. And we don't need to be doing any transforming in order to do that. You'll see we've got some other tools and we'll have a look at them in just a second. If we want to retransform this, say we don't like the scale, we scaled it too big and we want to scale it a bit smaller, we can hit Control T, or we can go up to the top and we'll go to Layer. No, we'll go to Edit. Edit, Transform, and we can choose either options in here, or we can choose Free Transform, which is what we just did. And we get back to that same view. Now it doesn't have the X in there, but it gives us the exact same options. You can see we've got our little corner pieces up the top there that we can play around with, and we've got the little target in the middle. And you'll see at the top here as well, we also have the cancel and the tick. So we get all our controls in there if we want. So we'll cancel out of that for now because we've just placed our image. Now what we want to do is add in a white border. But we don't want to make it onto this layer, we want to create it on another layer. So you'll see here we've got our different layers available to us. And what we want to do is actually create a new layer. So we can see layers by toggling them on and off with the eye. In this case we can toggle our image layer off and see the background layer. But if we toggle the other one, we can't see it go off and on because it's behind this layer. So we'll create a new layer. So we'll go down to the bottom here and you can see there is a button here called New. It might pop up for you. And it is the New Layer button. Looks like a piece of paper. You can see there, now we've created a new layer and it is on top of our previous layer. And we can select which layer we're working on by just clicking on it. So in this case, we'll be working on layer 1. Now we want to create a white border, but we want to do it with a color. So we'll go over to our toolbar and you can see we've got this black and this white. And this refers to our foreground color and our background color. And we'll go into this in future videos, but for now we want to be defining our foreground color because this is the color that we paint, we fill, we brush with. It is the foreground color. So if we click on that, you'll see we get this dialog box that comes up that lets us pick all these different colors. Has a whole heap of different controls for it. We can drag this panel up and down in this vertical bar to select different tones, and we can drag in this window and you can see here it kind of gives me an indication of the color that I'm about to choose, as well as the current foreground color. So if I wanted to adjust a shade, I could and see the comparison between the two. But for now we're going to drag it all the way up to the top left hand side and select white. We're going to hit OK. And then we'll go over to our toolbox and we want to select this one here, the paint bucket tool, because we want to fill this whole thing white. So we'll click and there we go. We've just done that. Now we want to cut out a section and we want to cut out basically where we want our image to show through because we can't really see it right now. So we'll go up the top left and you can see we have a bunch of different ways that we can choose stuff, but we want to use the rectangular marquee tool. Such a long name, such a long name. So we'll select that and this lets us draw boxes. So you'll see here I'm drawing them, I can draw them big, I can draw them small. Basically this is defining a selection. And when you're using Photoshop, you'll see these little what's called marching ants, and this defines a selection area. So whenever you see these define a selection area. They won't always be so perfectly straight. There'll be all kinds of wiggles around in different future videos as we explore the different ways that we can select stuff and create things here in Photoshop. But for now, you can see it's like that. Now I've drawn it out like so, but this probably isn't as perfect. And we might find that actually some of it's really thin and some of it's really thick. So how do we find the center of our document? Because otherwise we're going to be trying to guess it. So rather than doing that, let's go up to View at the top in our menu, and we're going to select Rulers. Now you can also do this by hitting Control R and toggling it on and off, and you'll see we get these rulers. Now it might be saying something different to you, but if we right click, you'll see, oh, we recognize some of these things, but we also get this other option, percent. So if you select percent, you can see now that we've got basically a ruler that goes from 0 all the way to, if we look where it lines up on the right hand side, 100. And so we want to create a ruler or a guide for us between 0 and 100. In fact, all the way in the middle, which is 50. So for now, let's deselect this. Now we can go up to select up the top in the menu and hit deselect, or we can hit Control D to also deselect. So you also want to make sure that if you're not working with your selected area, you hit Control D. But for now, we'll go over to our rulers and just take a look at where my cursor is. It's actually on the ruler bar. And we're going to click and drag, and you can see here we start creating this line, and you'll see there's at points in which it snaps. It snaps at 0 and it snaps at 100, but it also snaps at 50. So we're going to snap it in the middle like so, and we'll drag from the top down as well, and we'll snap and 50 as well. So there we go. That's the very center of our document, which is awesome to know. So now, making sure we have our rectangular marquee tool selected, we want to select from the middle. Now remember when we were transforming and we wanted to scale from the middle that we selected or held down Alt? Well, we'll be doing that again. In fact, we want to make sure this is in proportion as well because we're working with a square image. So we're going to hold Shift as well. So the same way that we scaled our image in proportion and from the center, we're going to hold those same two keys, Alt and Shift, and drag from that very middle point, and you can see we drag it out and it will in fact be perfectly square if we get to the very edge of our document, but we don't want that. We want to drag it in a little bit, and so the distance between our little selected area here and the edge of our document, that's going to be our white frame. So scale it to whichever area or size you want it to be. I'm going to select that, and now that we've selected our area, making sure that we've got layer 1 selected, we're going to hit delete. And there we go. We've cleared that area, and if we hit Control D again, we can deselect that, and we'll go back to the Move tool because we don't need the Marquee tool anymore. And you can see now we've created our white border around our image. Now we've got these guides in the way. We can get rid of them, but basically they're just there for when we're working in our Photoshop document. We don't need to worry about them. They're not going to be exported. But you can see now we've got our image placed, we've got our white border around it, and we might be going, oh, this is pretty good, but actually I want to kind of position it slightly different. So we can go back to our layers panel, select our image layer using our Move tool and drag it around slightly. So say if we wanted to kind of hide that this person's there a bit, we can do so like that. So now that we've created our final document, image, let's export it out as a JPEG. So we'll go to the menu and we'll select File and then Save As. Now we're going to go to Format and select JPEG, and that's what we're going to save it out as. We can call it Instagram 1, whatever we want to call it, and hit Save. Now we get a bunch of JPEG options. We want to save it as the highest quality file we can, so we'll save it as number 12. And we want to go with baseline standard. So we'll hit OK, and there we go, we've saved it out. Now let's also save our Photoshop document. We'll go to File, Save As, and we want to save it as a Photoshop PSD. Now we'll hit save. Now it wants me to replace stuff because that's basically what it says. And it kind of pops up with this maximize compatibility. We just want to click don't show again and hit OK. And there we have it, our first Photoshop document. Now say we want to reuse this frame but put another image in it. Well, we can just grab our File Explorer and drag a new image into it like so. It'll pop up and we get the same place transform options that we usually get. So we'll hold Alt and Shift and scale it up, and then we can always drag it over to roughly place it where we want it to go. We'll click the little tick box and we'll go, there it is. But you see, our frame isn't being shown, and that's because when we've imported stuff, it's imported it on top of our layer. That's our frame. So we need to click our layer 1 for our frame and drag it up. So we can shuffle layers around by simply clicking on them and dragging them around. So you can see there, now we've dragged it onto the very top and we have this white border surrounding our image. And again, we can go to File, Save As a JPEG, and save it as Instagram 2, or whatever we want to call it. We'll hit Save, maximum OK, and then we can simply go File, Save to save our Photoshop document with all the layers attached. So that's it for our very first tutorial and learning the basics of Photoshop. In the next tutorial, we'll be learning some of the other features that we can use here in the toolbar and what we can do more for this image, and we'll build upon the knowledge that you've already gained. We've already explored the different things that we can do with layering and creating new layers and moving layers around, and we've discovered the Move tool and the rectangle Marquee tool, and we've also discovered the Paint Bucket tool. We've learnt how to place images in documents and in fact create new documents. Until next time, my name is Bench. Thanks for watching.